Hi. This morning, today, Pastor Jonathan Pierre Puckett will share the message from Matthew chapter 14, verses 6 to 14. I will read in French, and Melinda will read in English. Hear the word of the Lord. Oh, glasses first. There we go. Or, le jour de l'anniversaire d'Hérode, la fille d'Hérodiade exécuta une danse devant les invités. Hérode était sous son charme. Aussi lui promit-il avec serment de lui donner tout ce qu'elle demanderait. À l'instigation de sa mère, elle lui dit « Donne-moi ici, sur un plat, la tête de Jean-Baptiste. »
On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guests and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here, on a platter, the head of John the Baptist."
Cette demande attrista le roi, mais à cause de son serment et de ses invités, il donna l'ordre de la lui accorder. Il envoya un soldat décapiter Jean-Baptiste dans la prison. La tête de ce dernier fut apportée sur un plat et remise à la jeune fille qui la porta à sa mère.
The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother.
Les disciples de Jean-Baptiste vinrent prendre son corps pour l'enterrer, puis ils allèrent informer Jésus de ce qui s'était passé. Quand Jésus entendit la nouvelle, il quitta la contrée en bateau et se retira à l'écart, dans un endroit désert. Mais les foules l'appriront. Elles sortiront de leur bourgade et le suivront à pied. Aussi, quand Jésus descendit du bateau, il vit une foule nombreuse. Alors il fut pris de compassion pour elle et guérit les malades.
John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by a boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. This is the word of the Lord.
I say it every time I get a mic, but it's because I mean it every single time. It is really good to be with you today. I am so grateful I get to be a part of this worshiping community. Whether you're in person or online, I am always very encouraged to be worshiping with this community, and I hope that that's the case for you as well. As you can probably tell, this is a different mic than I'm usually holding, and that is because Pastor Peter asked me to share the message today. And so thank you for this opportunity, Pastor Peter, and thank you, Rainier Avenue Church. Before I actually jump in, I do want to acknowledge, and just as we talked about the Women's Holiness Conference, I wanted to share just one thing that's been happening in the youth group recently, and that is our 8th and 9th grade women's small group has been leading us through a series on the women in the Bible. And so they've invited some guest preachers to come and share, and that is something that I am just very excited about, seeing the women in our church leading us. And so just wanted to say thank you to our 8th and 9th grade women right now. So that is completely aside. I did not plan that, but just wanted to say how grateful I am for them. Today we find ourselves in the Lenten season, continuing our series titled A God Who Grieves. Before I go any further, I'm going to level with all of you. This title, this series, makes me feel uncomfortable. Grief makes me feel uncomfortable. It's ironic because my favorite books in the Bible are Ecclesiastes and Psalms, which the entire mood of both those books is one of grief. But grief makes me feel uncomfortable. To me, to experience grief, it feels like something terrible must have happened. Something terrible must have gone very wrong. I usually experience grief when I've already had an experience of that is either unwanted or unplanned for. And so the idea of God experiencing something that is unwanted or unplanned for makes me feel uncomfortable. Probably not alone there, but this series that we've been in has led us through some really important stories where people in the Bible experience grief. Specifically, we've been looking at some passages, some stories in the days leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. And it kind of amazes me at how many instances of grief there are in our Bible. There's enough to spend an entire month looking at them, just studying them. And we haven't even scratched the surface of how many there actually are. We've already read our passage for today, and for some of us, this may be very familiar story. For others, this might be your first time hearing it. And so, forgive me, I'm just going to spend a few moments going through this, setting the stage for what happens here. The story begins years beforehand, before what we just read, when a couple that the Bible describes as very old has an angel appear to them. And this angel tells Zechariah, the husband, that his wife will become pregnant. Her name is Elizabeth, and she will conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him John. Several months later, an angel appears to another woman whose name is Mary. And Mary is Elizabeth's cousin, and she is told that she will also conceive and bear a son, and she will name him Jesus. After Mary has conceived Jesus, she goes and visits her cousin Elizabeth. And something really interesting happens during that visit. As Mary approaches with Jesus in her womb, John in Elizabeth's jumps, alerted to the fact that the Messiah has come near. And this Messiah is actually his second cousin. Years later, Elizabeth's son is born and grows into the man known as John the Baptist. And Mary's son is born and grows into the man that we know as Jesus. We don't learn much about their relationship or their childhood growing up, but what we do get is the first story, or one of the first stories ever told about Jesus' adult life, is an interaction between these two cousins. When John is preaching and baptizing people in the Jordan River, preparing the way for the Messiah, Jesus appears. He's baptized by his cousin, and together they hear the voice of God declare that this is my son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. If we fast forward a few years, we learn that John has become somewhat of an activist. He has spoken out vigorously against Herod the Tetrarch. Difficult to say. Because Herod has married his brother's wife, who is also his great niece. You thought your family was complicated. So Herod has John imprisoned. And that's where our readers picked up the story today. Herod then throws a banquet. It's his birthday. He throws a banquet. He invites all of the most powerful, most honored, most respected people in his region. And then his new wife's daughter, who is his great-great-niece, they're related somehow, other than just stepdaughter. And then she dances for him and pleases him so much, he says, I will give you anything you ask for. And every commentary, just as a side note, every commentary I've read on this passage makes a point of saying just how foolish Herod is in this moment. How much of a mistake it is to ever say you will give someone anything that they ask for, especially in front of a crowd of people. So, prompted by her mother, this young woman asked for the head of her mother's most harsh critic, John the Baptist. This is a kind of a messed up story, and it's in moments like this where I remember, the Bible doesn't make a very nice coloring book or picture book. It's not a children's story. And what makes this so uncomfortable for me, what makes this a really harsh story, is the fact that Herod is so scared, so afraid of the people that are his guests, so afraid of looking weak and foolish, that he breaks the Jewish law. He not only executes this man without a trial, but does so in the privacy of his jail cell and beheads him. He has John executed and then has his head presented to this young woman and her mom. It's then that Jesus finds out. And John's second cousin hears about his murder, his execution, and we're told that immediately he retreats to a desolate place. Up until a week or so ago, I was prepared to preach a very different sermon on a very different story. But as some of you know, my grandmother passed away. And as I grieved and prayed and processed and still doing all of those things, as I read scripture, I stumbled across this story. And something clicked like it never had before. The fact that Jesus grieved the loss, the death, the murder, the execution of a family member, probably multiple family members throughout his life. I don't know why, but that reality brought me some level of comfort and some deep confusion. I've never thought about it before. I've never thought about this Jesus that I worship having experienced the grief of losing a family member. I know about Lazarus. I know he's grieved friends. But there is something different about losing someone that you are connected to, that you're related to, that you've known since birth. The last few years have been incredibly painful for the vast majority of us. We've all been given new and more reasons to grieve. I've lost 3 grandparents in the last 3 years. My grandmother, Kyoko, you can actually see her right here. She and my grandfather, Warren, those are pictures of them. And my grandmother, Kyoko, was the last living grandparent I had until 2.5 weeks ago. She's an incredibly special person to me. She was incredibly playful. I have memories of her jumping on a bed with me. She was very loving, probably one of the funniest people I know. And I have these memories of her jumping on beds, of her coming to my middle school classroom to teach my classmates how to make mochi. I know, I started thinking about that and I got hungry too. Also, she is really my strongest connection to Japanese culture and our own family history. There are stories that just won't be told anymore. There's shared experiences that we had together that it feels like I've lost for forever because she's no longer alive. And it's when I was reading this story that I began to wonder, did Jesus have any of these feelings? Did he experience this when he heard about the death of his second cousin, John? Again, this is the same cousin who baptized him. This is the same cousin who witnessed the Holy Spirit descend and say, "This is my son, whom I love. With you I am greatly pleased." This is the cousin who saw and understood exactly who Jesus was from the beginning, who recognized him as the Messiah from the womb. So when Jesus heard about his cousin John, we're told he withdraws by boat to a desolate place. a place that is removed from society, a place that is removed from towns, from people, from anywhere he could be interrupted, so that way he could grieve and process and pray in peace. But when Jesus lands, he sees a crowd of people who traveled out to the same desolate place in order to see him. And the author of Matthew says, Jesus was moved with compassion for them, and he healed their sick. We're going to pause right there, because there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of things that happen in this story. And I am very curious. I'm a youth pastor, so I don't ask rhetorical questions. Every question I ask is meant to be answered. So feel free to shout out, write it in the chat. What stands out to you in this story? Disregard the slides. What stands out to you in this story? From whether it's what we read or it's something that was narrated from the beginning of Jesus and John's birth. Is there something that stands out to you? I'll wait. What was that? The humanness of Jesus, yeah. This is my son, my beloved. With you I'm greatly pleased, yeah. For me, it was the phrase, he had compassion on them. Maybe this is a given, but Jesus had compassion for a whole group of people, even when he found out that his cousin had just been murdered. Jesus had compassion. The Son of God who humbled himself and lived among regular people, who experienced loss and grief, rejection and heartache, he still had compassion. There's my summary of the gospel for us. This is why I choose to follow Jesus. Because even when Christians aren't always very Christ-like, Jesus had compassion and promises that we can become more and more like him. We too can have compassion for others even when we're in the pits of grief and despair. It feels like we're there a lot these days. Later that day, when all of the disciples want Jesus to send the crowd away so the people can get food, Jesus performs one of his most famous miracles. He asks them, "What food have you brought?" Again, they are in a desolate place. This is a place removed from towns, from society, from people, from food. And people get hungry. People get hangry. So Jesus asked them, "What food have you brought?" They hand Jesus 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And Jesus takes these and looks out over the crowd of more than 5,000 men and an undocumented number of women and children. That means there's a lot of people. I don't know if you've ever tried to feed just a household. 5,000 people plus their spouses and kids. That's a lot. He looks out, sees all of these people. He breaks the bread, divides the fish, and has his disciples distribute this amongst the more than 5,000 people. And this is crazy. Everyone eats their fill. And the Bible says that there are 12 baskets full of food that's left over. I've read this story so many times over the last 14 years of following Jesus. But something I learned recently has changed the way that I understand or I read or I receive this story. Did you know that this is the only story where Jesus performs a miracle that's recorded in all 4 gospel accounts? This is the only story out of 38 miracle stories recorded in the Gospels that appears in Matthew, in Mark, in Luke, and in John. What that tells me is that there's something significant about this story. And as I don't know if this is what the significant aspect is, but as I was in my own process, as I was in my own mourning season, and I read this passage, what stood out to me was that Jesus had compassion. So I wonder if the significant thing about this story is that has to do with the fact that this miracle only takes place because Jesus allows his grief to be interrupted by compassion. That Jesus allows this compassion to flow out of his grief. And before I say anything else, let me be crystal clear. This is not a message about neglecting or rejecting your own need to process and grieve. Immediately after Jesus feeds the crowd of people, he sends them and his disciples away so he can climb a mountain. He's already in a desolate place that's supposed to be removed from people, removed from society, and he then climbs a mountain to get some peace and solitude so he can grieve and pray. I say this because it seems clear in the text to me that Jesus did prioritize his own need to grieve and process and pray. So don't neglect your need to do the same. My point is that in the midst of his grief, in the midst of his exhaustion, maybe even because of his grief and exhaustion, Jesus allowed himself to be moved to compassion for other people. And this act of compassion led to the most written about and one of the most famous miracle stories that we have of Jesus' earthly ministry. So what if in the midst of our own grief, in the midst of our own exhaustion, we allowed ourselves to be interrupted by compassion for others? After my grandmother passed on Thursday night, my aunts, I have two aunts that were staying with my grandmother in her room with her in the nursing facility. My grandmother passed at 1 or 1:30 in the morning, and they were out the door by 2. What they told me is we couldn't stay there a minute longer. It was exhausting. They had told me that even before she passed. As soon as she goes, we can't stay here. They drove up to the Mount Vernon area in Washington, a couple hours away, and then they called me and asked if we could go visit, if we could go to them. Our plan was that they were going to come to our place the next day, where my mom and my sister had just flown in, so Rihanna and I and my mom and sister could all just see them and eat together and share stories about my grandmother. And they asked us to drive a couple hours away. It wasn't a huge ask, but I got to tell you, I don't know that I can't remember a time where I have been as emotionally, physically exhausted as I was 2.5 weeks ago. I didn't want to go. I really did not want to go. My mom and sister, though, they let their own grief get interrupted. They heard in the voices of my aunts that same exhaustion, that same weariness that we were all feeling. And they said, we think we should go visit them. It seems incredibly small. It feels really small maybe, but my aunts told me multiple times, they kept repeating it after we visited. They are so glad we came. It had been 10 years since they had seen my mom and my sister. It had been so long, and they were so grateful, and it just kept repeating over and over and over again how grateful they were that we drove to them. They know that we are tired. And the truth is, I'm as grateful as they were. I was not in the moment. I was very tired, very, very weary. I hope that as we process and experience our own grief, we do so with compassion. The same compassion that interrupted Jesus and flowed out over the thousands of people who followed him to a desolate place. Again, hear me say, Jesus did prioritize his own need to grieve and process and pray. He climbed a mountain to get that solitude, but he let grief be interrupted. So again, I hope we can do the same. As the worship team comes back up, and we enter into a time where we will remember another meal that Jesus provided. I want to share with you an observation that Stanley Haravas, a brilliant Bible scholar, something he noticed. He wrote, that Jesus has compassion on the crowd is best understood in contrast to Herod's banquet. Jesus provides food for those without food solely because they are hungry. Herod provides food for those who are not without food as a demonstration of his power. Jesus feeds the 5,000 because he has compassion for them. Jesus has compassion for the crowd, so his desire to feed them comes solely from his love for them. This feeding of the 5,000 also leads us to anticipate Jesus' final meal, where he breaks bread and drinks wine with some of his closest friends. If you didn't know this already, apparently Jesus' entire ministry revolved around food. Another reason I really want to be like him. We look back to and somehow are able to participate in this meal with Jesus and his followers through the sacrament of communion. We recall Jesus taking some bread and breaking it. Says, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the meal, he took the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Whenever you drink it, remember me."